All free episodes of Addressing Gettysburg are brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. To become a sponsor, send an email to matt@addressinggettysburg.com. And to be a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg today. And we thank you in advance.
Well, the season is winding down, this winter lecture season, 2022. And it seems like just yesterday I did the first one. I guess it's been a while back yet, early January. So thank you for coming out here in late February of 2022 for the winter lecture series. And we hope it's been educational and fun for you. I've talked with a couple people outside who've been to several of them already. So we'll try to continue that momentum. And we're going to today talk about if practicable. And so that's a mouthful, isn't it? People have asked me about, if practicable. If you know about the battle, you've heard the term before. And if practicable, it's an important subject in this battle because a lot has been made to do about General Lee telling General Ewell on the southern side of the battlefield on the first day of the battle to take the heights, that Cemetery Hill, if practicable, without bringing on a general engagement. And there have been volumes of books written on the battle, and there's usually part of a chapter devoted to that. And it's because the lost cause, which was the South's spin on after the war on what they were fighting for, it really obsessed over the thought that the battle was lost on the first day by Ewell not taking that order literally and seizing Cemetery Hill. That Stonewall Jackson, if he were still alive, he would have taken the hill. He wouldn't have hesitated. And that was near and dear to the heart of Southerners. And General Ewell took the high road. He didn't get down in the muck and the mire and defend himself. He just stayed regally above the argument. But and that helped him, I think, in the long run. But he would have heard it. He would have been aware that people were saying that he should have taken the order, if practicable, a little more literally, and followed through at the end of the first day's battle success by seizing the heights of Cemetery Hill. Now, we're doing history at a higher level when we look for patterns across time and space. Those of you who've been with me on battle walks over the years heard me say this dozens of times, but it's so true that looking for patterns across time and space tells us something deeper about human behavior. And so we learn ultimately history is most beneficial when it tells us something about human behavior. It's really the only discipline where we can understand the present and even forecast the future or try to avoid negatives in the future by studying the past. No two historical events or two historical time periods are exactly alike. There are too many variables and contingencies. But there are parallels in human behavior. What goes around comes around. It's called cycles in history. And so looking for patterns goes deep. It goes deep into the subconscious of human behavior. And if practicable is a term that was not used only by Lee to Ewell at the end of the first day. When I was fairly new here years ago, I also focused on the order given from Lee to Ewell. But over the years in doing battle walks and writing things here and there and interacting with you in the field, it became apparent, I just stumbled onto other people who gave that order, including Lee, who gave it on other occasions during the campaign and the battle itself. So that allows us to look at a pattern. We're going to look at a sample of several times where it's used, and we're going to look at how it was applied. Okay? Now, one last introductory point to set this up. One of the lenses that we look at the past through is language. You can take the same event. You could go out to the angle, third day of the battle, Pickett's charge, and look at the same ground and tell a completely different story by just turning the lens and looking at it through a different lens. You could talk about Cemetery Ridge through the environment. Then you could stop after a 45-minute program if you've got any energy left. You can then talk about in the same location, technology, whether it be rifled weapons and artillery and the like, logistics. In the same ground, you could stand there and talk about cycles, and you could bring in what Napoleon said and did and what the Civil War soldiers emulated. You could talk about racism, misogyny. You could talk about great events, great people. There are many different ways that you can look at the same subject and there be no overlap, and they're completely different subjects. You just are focused on something else entirely different. So one of the ways that we look at the past, systems and structures is another way we look at the past. But one of the lenses we look at is through language and rhetoric. And you hear that, let's say, in the last 30 years, certainly if you've tuned in at all to politics, you'll hear discussions about messaging and the importance of messaging, because it's understood that rhetoric is very important. When students will ask, why did the civil rights occur in the 1950s and 60s? Civil rights movement really take off in the 50s and 60s, and second wave feminism in the 70s. It's because of the rhetoric, in part, the rhetoric of Franklin Roosevelt, who justified America's entry into war before Congress by saying that America was fighting for 4 freedoms: freedom from want, fear, hunger, freedom of speech, and that America's war was about freeing the world to not have from those fears. And so African Americans came home after the war, and they had just freed Europe from Nazism and fascism, and then they had to sit in the back of the bus. And they thought, well, we really took those words to heart. We saw them on posters in our camp, and we're in segregated regiments and so on. And the power of rhetoric, and you'll find that all throughout history, all men are created equal is another one that's ignited one movement after another. So language and rhetoric is very important. I would say maybe the most important words from this battle, outside of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, is the term, if practicable. It's certainly one that's been revisited over and over. So we're going to look at this battle through language and rhetoric, if practicable. So this is a comparative study of the most cross-examined words from the Gettysburg Campaign. Now, what is practicable? What is practicable? Merriam-Webster said that practicable is a mixture of practical and capable. So practical is something that's useful or sensible. Think about if you have a pair of socks that you like to wear all the time. They might not be the fanciest ones. They might not be embroidered. They might not have gold stitching through them. But they're practical. They're warm, but they allow your feet to breathe in different types of weather and not trap moisture and so on. Things are practical. You could buy a really fancy car, but instead you buy one that's practical, that gets better gas mileage. So it means if something's practical, it's useful, it's sensible. It's something that can be used, will be used often, it won't collect dust, and it's sensible. And then the other half of the word, capable, means able to be done or able to put into practice. So you put the two together and you have useful, sensible, and able to put into practice. So this order is complex, you see. And we're going to, let's say something else about it too as we go along. We're going to find out that practicable is an order that generals who are very comfortable with themselves and comfortable with the people in the field they were giving the orders to, they had a great deal of trust for them, they would use the word practicable because it allowed the person on the ground closest to the event to make a decision as events demanded. We're going to jump right into our first example, and this is Samuel Johnston. Samuel Johnston, some of you will remember, was an engineer recommended to Robert E. Lee by Jeb Stuart. Stuart raved over him, and Lee thought highly of him. Lee leaned on him on more than one battle. We know that Samuel Johnston in 1864 was troubleshooting railroads in Georgia. After the war, he moved to just outside of New York City. He was an engineer there. Industrial Revolution required engineering. So if you had engineering skills, you were quickly hired in industrial cities. So he had a lifetime of engineering. Engineers measure twice and cut once. If you know an engineer, they're very precise and very methodical. They don't do things willy-nilly, and they don't shoot from the hip. So Samuel Johnston was given the orders to scout out the Union left on the morning of the second day of the battle, right after daylight. This would be the area of the Round Tops, as we would call them today, the wheat field, the famous peach orchard, Devil's Den, and he would be the first Southerner to lay eye on these areas up close. He said that he learned early on, he said he learned this from Lee, who had passed it on to him from his time in Mexico when he had done some spying and scouting. You learn a lot more in small groups. If you send the cavalry in with 1,500 to spy, you quickly give away your cover, don't you? So he would travel in groups, he said, no more of 4 or 5. And we know 4 of the people that were in the party. There might have been as many as 5. And they would have been inconspicuous if they had a bar on their sleeve or some insignia that would give away their rank. They would be careful to cover that, exchange a soldier hat for a straw hat, so they would blend in with the civilians. There were a lot of local people who had waited to the last minute to leave the battlefield, and they were starting to flee like refugees down the Baltimore Pike, down the Taneytown Road towards Maryland. And Johnston could just blend right in with all of the farmers and the farmers' families and get up close and really see what needed to be seen. So Johnston wrote that Lee, he wrote a letter, he wrote 4 letters, and I've done a synoptic study on this. If you go to Troy Harman YouTube, you can find an hour version of this where I go through his entire scouting mission and how it impacted Longstreet's attack in that area on the second day. But Samuel Johnston met with Lee in the morning along Seminary Ridge, most likely, near the seminary, and these were Lee's orders to his engineer who was to scout the Union left. About 4 o'clock next morning, says Johnston, General Lee called me and directed that I go at once and make reconnaissance as far as practicable on the right. Now, as far as practicable. Now, my mind works in patterns. Professors beat that into my head. You know, make connections. You're doing history at a higher level when you're looking for connections. This is how people behave across time and space. I remember when that just came out from the page when I went through the vertical files and looked at his letter there where he describes to Bishop George Peterkin, which would have been after 1878 because he addresses him as bishop. We know he wasn't a bishop in Richmond until 1878. But in any case, Johnston said that his orders were to go as far as practicable on the right. Now that would be the Union left, the area of the Round Tops. Now as far as practical, now this gets into Lee's style of command. Edward Porter Alexander, who was in charge of Longstreet's artillery for Pickett's charge, would write in his book years later, it wasn't published right away, it was published in fairly recent years, edited by Gary Gallagher, called Fighting for the Confederacy. But in there, he says that, he talks about how Lee really needed more staff. He suffered from not having a larger staff, like the Union Army had. He implied that there were times where Southern columns would stop and just stand and twiddle their thumbs and waste valuable time, whereas if there had been more staff coordinating back and forth in the era before smartphones, you would have had someone to quickly follow up and get clarification on where they were to turn and how they were to maneuver and those kinds of things. The valuable time was lost by not having a more extensive staff. For Lee, that's not how Lee operated. He wanted a smaller staff, a few trusted confidants, Walter Taylor, and on down the list. I'm thinking of Harrison as well. The people that he looked to as his staff, he kept to a minimal. And the reason for that would be that after Special Orders 191 was lost near Frederick in the Antietam Campaign in mid-September of 1862, from that point on, he was once bitten, twice shy. You all will recall that his orders were handwritten inside of a cigar wrapper and found around a fire by the 13th New Jersey and 27th Indiana, passed up to the chain of command, verified that that was Lee that actually would have given those orders. It allowed General McClellan to know where Lee's army was and move in that direction, which led to the battle in Maryland rather than in Pennsylvania. He arrested his movements because of a cigar wrapping. Once bitten, twice shy, Lee gave a lot of verbal orders here at the battle. A lot of orders that were just given verbally because he did not trust notes getting intercepted. He didn't trust, if you have, let's say, 6 staff officers passing messages to the front, you can keep a closer track on where they are than if you had 100. The Union Army preferred to have the 100 staff officers. And that's more occasion that one of them gets captured, their letters get captured. That happened more than once, by the way. I'll just throw this in as a side note. General Sykes' letter to Slocum on the morning of July 2nd was captured, revealing exactly where the 5th Corps was in relation to the 12th Corps. It allowed General Ewell to understand that his left flank wasn't protected by Stuart and that he had an entire Union Corps 4 miles from his flank at Bonneville. The more staff you have, the more loose ends there are. So Lee just kept it all undercover. He wanted a few people. Also, when you have a large amount of staff, yes, there's an efficiency about that. Quick responses back and forth, more than enough message carriers. But you also have, when you have a large staff, that also indicates that you don't trust the person on the ground. So Lee put a lot of trust on the person on the front lines. And in a time when communication was slower, there was an immediacy. One of the reasons Lee won several of his early battles in the East was because McClellan, Pope, Burnside, they would give an order. They would keep the person on the ground partially in the dark. So when they ran into problems, they had to stop and wait and send staff back to McClellan, he was the only one that had the big picture, the knowledge of the broader concepts. And in that valuable time lost, the Southerners, Lee and others, that's when they would attack and throw them back on their heels. They would wait for those moments where they would stall and have to wait through the chain of command to get, whereas Lee would just rather broadly describe what his goals and objectives were to the Major General out front, who might be 3 or 4 miles from him, and say, you decide what bridge to cross, you decide what roads to take. I'm not going to give you any specifics. You know what my goal is. I want to bring critical mass on such and such a point. You figure out how to do it. If an opportunity comes, don't lose 15, 20 minutes. Windows of opportunities open and close in 30 minutes. So Lee's style was his style was to say, go to the far right as practicable. And that fit with Johnston. He was comfortable with that. Now, one more quick point on that. Johnston says in one of his letters, he said, when Lee and I talked about what I was supposed to do, he said he never mentioned that I was to do a route reconnaissance. That is, look for specific routes that Longstreet's troops would have to take to get into position to attack. He never asked me specifically to find the best artillery platforms for Alexander's guns, which Johnston did that at Fredericksburg. He chose Marie's Heights. Well, that would be obvious, but he helped pick out the gun positions in advance for Lee. He was used to picking out the ground. Johnston said, Lee didn't tell me to do an area reconnaissance. That means find out all the geography in the area. He said he didn't tell me any of those things because he knew I would do that, and he knew that was expected. So Lee would just say, go far to the right as practicable. and then that leaves it up to the person that's there. So that means that it is something that can be done. It's feasible. You're capable of doing it, carrying it out into practice, and it's something that's useful and something that's sensible. Okay, now Johnston went out and he did his reconnaissance, and he came back and he found General Lee around 7 a.m. His reconnaissance went on from 4:15 a.m. till around 7. He arrived back at Army headquarters near the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and he writes this in his article to Bishop George Peterkin. I stood behind General Lee and traced on the map the route over which I had made the reconnaissance. When I got to the extreme right of our reconnaissance on the Little Round Top, General Lee turned and looking at me said, "Did you get there?" I assured him I did. Then Lee said to General Longstreet, "I think you had better move on." Now, let me give you a little bit of clarification here. I want to build context around the story because it adds so much to it. The context here is that, as a general rule in war, when two armies would meet during the Civil War, oftentimes they were a mile apart on comparable ridges like Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. And they sent out pickets and skirmishers out of no man's land. You send out 500 skirmishers, your enemy sends out 500 skirmishers. They do quick math. Skirmishers are 1/10 of the force that they're covering, so you know you're about to attack 5,000 men or defend with 5,000 men. Skirmishers also sharpshoot at officers. They gather information about the ground, where there are dead spaces in the ground. They go back and tell artillerymen to cut fuses to places that they can't see at ground level. The skirmishers are out there. They find out all this information. They gather it up. They're so important. They also fire at flag bearers and people that are important to communications when an attack starts. They're out of no man's lands. All right, that's the vacuum. In a battle, Civil War battle, if any part of the vacuum is not filled by one side, it communicates non-verbally to the other side. The other side, that's yours for free. And in a game of kill or be killed, your opponent will take what's for free. They will fill all the space that you allow them to fill. So if you want to defend Little Round Top, for instance, if you don't have troops out in front of that, you're communicating all the ground out in front is free. And they don't have to lose a man to start their attack right in front of their objective. You want to slow them down. You want to create metaphoric speed bumps in front of Walmart to slow down a car from going 30 or 40 miles an hour. You put humans out there to slow down any attack way out in front of with a defense in depth. What Lee's comment to Longstreet meant after he listened to Johnston's reconnaissance, Johnston traced it on Lee's map exactly where he went. What Lee was saying to Longstreet is, they're giving us Little Round Top for free. You had better move on. In other words, okay, so time can't be lost. So he made it all the way to Little Round Top. Now, why would he want to go to Little Round Top? My son is studying aeronautics, and he loves drones and everything to do with flight. Drones in modern times are used on modern battlefields. You just send up, a platoon sends up a drone, it flies over to where a knoll, beyond a knoll that you can't see. That information is analyzed in a truck nearby. Once it's clear, you bring the drone back, put it in a handsome case, and then the platoon walks over the ridge. They know it's safe over on the other side. The equivalent back then, well, in ancient times, the equivalent would be a tower on a castle. And in the Civil War, they started to use hydrogen balloons that way. They were too clumsy to get them by rail up here to Gettysburg, so they didn't make it here. But they used Little Round Top and places like there as promontories to look down. The Union had a signal station up there. They had tripods, scopes, looking glasses, we would call them binoculars. And if they saw a cloud of dust 10, 15 miles away, if they saw campfires 5, 10 miles away at night, they would send 30, 40 cavalry out to debunk or affirm what they saw, very much like what a drone would do today. And so you're able to keep track of movements. That's why the Southerners carefully moved behind Seminary Ridge. They used the woods of Seminary Ridge like curtain to maneuver. So Little Round Top not only it wouldn't have just been an accident, it would have been the place that Johnston wanted to make it to. That would have been because that to him was his drone. That was his hot air balloon. That was his hydrogen balloon. That was his medieval tower. That's the place. And when he got up there, he could look down and he would have seen Buford's horses. A lot of horses were down there drinking from Plum Run. You like the sound effects there. And he would have looked down and seen heard men coughing and getting up in the morning and campfires and smoke as Sickles' men were not in position. They were encamped from a long march from Emmitsburg. So Johnston got up there and he took that information of exactly where Sickles' troops were. That's before they moved out to the peach orchard. Okay, so as far as practicable, Jeb Stuart is another good example as far as practicable. We all know about Stuart. And I'm going to read to you from his account in the ORs. That's the official reports published in the 1880s. The government printing office declassified, the government declassified original reports and memorandums, and then they were published, and generals that were still alive, officers, used them to write their memoirs in the 1880s, 1890s. That's why it was that late before the first serious scholarship came out on the battle. Stuart's report would have come out in the 1880s, long after his death. But his report filed immediately after the battle says, I began to look for some other point at which to direct an effective blow. Now, this is early June of 1863, while the Southern Army's still moving north, and the Union Army's trying to find them and mirror their movements along the Blue Ridge. He said, I submitted to the commanding general, that's Lee, the plan of leaving a brigade's around 1,500 troops, or so in my present front, and passing through Hopewell or some other gap in Bull Run Mountains, attain the enemy's rear, passing between his main body and Washington, and cross into Maryland, joining our army north of the Potomac. And many of you know this story as the Southern troops were moving in the insular qualities of the Cumberland Shenandoah Valley, moving north and using Big Brother as a shield, that is the Blue Ridge Mountains in the north. It's called South Mountain, to cover and conceal them. And they used it as a plumb bob chalk line to guide them north. And then they crossed over from the Cumberland Valley into the Susquehanna Valley to fight the Battle of Gettysburg. But Stuart, he had been helping the Southern troops move from the Culpeper area over the mountains from the east side to the west side in Virginia and move north. And there were battles at Upperville, Aldie, and Middleburg. But then he decided to leave some cavalry, some Southern cavalry, to guard the wagon trains in the rear of Lee's army, even as the head of his columns were already in northern Maryland. He wanted to do something more daring and ride around and get between Washington and the Union Army. And so he wanted to do this, and he requested of Lee to be able to do that. The commanding general, that's Lee, says Stuart, wrote me authorizing this move if I deemed it practicable, and also what instructions should be given the officer in command of the two brigades left in front of the enemy. He also notified me that one column should move via Gettysburg and the other via Carlisle toward the Susquehanna. So Lee's already thinking about Gettysburg and thinking about Carlisle before the invasion begins. And directed me after crossing, that's the Potomac, to proceed with all dispatch to join the right, that's Early, and that's not my parenthesis, that's in his report, Early of the Army in Pennsylvania. And you're looking at the Civil War Battlefield Trust, American Battlefield Trust map on the right. And Stuart's out on the far right in red, and you can see his movements going up through Maryland. He went through Westminster, eventually made his way to Hanover. He was headed to the area of Hanover Junction, in part because he knew Early was going to be there. Early was damaging rail in that direction. He thought he could connect with Early who was on the vanguard of General Ewell's movements. Ewell's troops were leading the invasion into Pennsylvania. So he felt like he could still protect the right flank of the Southern Army, as he would do here tactically during the battle. East Cavalry Field is the left flank, I meant to say left flank, of the Southern Army here at Gettysburg. So tactically and on a much broader operational level, he was to stay connected with Ewell and Early specifically. But Early had already been recalled to Gettysburg. The battle broke out on July 1st. Stuart's cavalry didn't find Early because Early had already backtracked towards Gettysburg west. Stuart found his way to Carlisle, about 35 miles north of here. They burned the war barracks there. Local people told them there had been a battle going on in Gettysburg on July 1st, and then he arrived here, did Stuart, on July 2nd. So Stuart deemed it practicable that he could ride around behind the Union lines, get between them and Washington, and then still connect with Ewell's flank in the area of Hanover or York. And that didn't happen because of the fight that broke out on July 1st at Gettysburg. Now, Lee would write about this in his own official report. He said, General Stuart determined to pass around the rear of the Federal Army with 3 brigades and cross the Potomac between it and Washington, believing that he would be able, there's your word able, by that route to place himself on our right flank in time, well, it is right operationally, in time to keep us properly advised of the enemy's movements. He marched from Salem on the night of June 24th, intending to pass west of Centerville, but found the enemy's forces so distributed as to render that route impracticable. So he acknowledges that the word practicable was used in his original order communications with Stuart by repeating it in his own official report, does Lee. Adhering to his original plan, he was forced to make a wide detour. Now, I'm focusing on rhetoric and language, military rhetoric, and I'm focusing on if practicable. But here and there are some other words that are delicious to talk about, and we're going to just mention one here, the word detour. These are military words that literally come off the page once you become accustomed to seeing them. If you go through Jomini's Art of War, detour is in there. Frederick the Great writes about detour. The reason Lee decided not to follow Longstreet's idea of going around the Union left flank with a wide arcing march on July 2nd was because he was leery of detours. And the commanders will use that word in italics because they know they're drawing it right from a West Point textbook. And Lee was the superintendent at West Point in the 1850s. So detour, I don't want to water this down and make it less significant, but just imagine Penn State playing football and they run trick plays on offense where they just run around the end, or they toss it to one side and then another guy throws it back to the other side. Trick plays to run around the end. It signals to the defense weakness that they can't go straight ahead. They have to use trickery to be able to move the ball. Eventually, that dooms you because you're sending a message of we can't go straight ahead. We don't have the beef up front to push you off the line and move forward. We have to trick you to move the ball. On a battlefield, you have to show the ability to go straight ahead at times. It shows strength that you can go straight at someone. If you're always maneuvering around the flanks, that signals to your opponent weakness, that you're not able to go with them toe-to-toe. So detours are also, Jomini talks about this, they're very difficult. If you're sending somebody out on a wide arc and you're trying to maneuver with logistics, logistical trains, maybe animals, not only pulling those trains but following them, and infantry and artillery, when you move on a wide arc, you give your opponent a shorter distance from the base to attack any part of the line. And if the circuitous march gets stretched out in gaps like an accordion, portions of the line can get isolated and overrun. Detours are very tricky and very dangerous. Sometimes it's safer just to go straight ahead and keep your forces consolidated. Does everybody see that? Okay, so Stuart made a detour, and Lee purposefully italicized that. That's not my italicis. So that's sort of a way of suggesting he took the weak way out in this case. Okay, now the most famous use of the word, if practicable, is Lee order to Ewell. I've already hinted at it in our beginning, but let's go right at it here. Now this is from Lee's report, his longer report, more comprehensive one, filed in January 1864. He wrote, "It was ascertained from the prisoners," that's on the first day of the battle, during the Union Army's fall back to Cemetery Hill. He said it was ascertained from Union prisoners that we had been engaged with 2 corps of the Army. That would be the 1st and 11th Corps, formerly commanded by General Hooker. So for Lee, he's getting confirmation that Hooker's no longer in command. He already knew that as early as June 28th, but he starts to get more confirmation on the battlefield with the people that are being interrogated. And that the remainder of that army under General Meade was approaching Gettysburg. Without information as to that's the Union Army's proximity, the strong position which the enemy had assumed, that would be Cemetery Hill, could not be attacked without danger of exposing the 4 divisions present, already weakened and exhausted by a long and bloody struggle, to overwhelming numbers of fresh troops. Okay, the 4 divisions he's talking about here are what's left of Rhodes' division, Early's division, Heath, and Pender, and nearby is Anderson's division. And there's been a lot of talk over the years about where was Anderson and how close was he. It was decided that Anderson would be kept in reserve. He was just west of Gettysburg along Marsh Creek. So there are really 4 divisions. A division could be anywhere from 3,500 to 5,000 troops. By the end of the first day's battle, it would have been 2/3 that number at most. So, because of all of this, Lee says General Ewell was therefore instructed to carry the hill, that's Cemetery Hill, occupied by the enemy, if he found it practicable, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of other divisions of the Army, which were ordered to hasten forward. He decided to await Johnston's division, that's Major General Edward Allegheny Johnston's division, which had marched from Carlisle by the road west of mountains to guard the trains of his corps, and consequently did not reach Gettysburg until a late hour. Johnston's division would eventually drop down into the railroad cut at 7 Stars, just west of Gettysburg, to bypass A.P. Hill's wagon trains along the Cashtown Pike. Local people told him, this is how we get around paying the toll. You know, your entire wagon will fit down in that unfinished railroad cut. So they used the railroad cut to Johnston's division, close to 6,000 troops, the last component of Ewell's corps. They didn't fight on the first day, and Ewell was going to wait for them to arrive. So without those extra troops being here, Ewell didn't make the attack. He decided it was not practical. And let's look at Ewell's perspective. He wrote in his report, the enemy had fallen back to a commanding position known as Cemetery Hill, south of Gettysburg, and quickly showed a formidable front there. Now, one of the things I want to do here real quick, I didn't emphasize this enough, and I'll be quick on this. I let the visuals speak for themselves, but I'm going to lose a few seconds and go back and have you look at them again. Did you know Cemetery Hill looked like this? That was before Steinway Avenue, before Colt Park. Cemetery Hill, can you see the East Cemetery Hill or Evergreen Cemetery Hill gatehouse at the top of the hill? You're looking from the west side of the hill, along the area of Fairview Avenue, Culp Street, in that area. So that's how it would have looked before the businesses were built along Steinway Avenue. And you can see the Taneytown Road in the middle of the picture running left to right. There's a big crater on your left. That was a quarry. There was a lot of rock taken from that and used for local roadways. It was also used as an ash pit. We had trouble with the old visitor center. Some of you remember that. It was tore down in 2009. It was built right there. We wouldn't scrape the parking lot in the winters there for snow because it would chip away at the blacktop no matter how many different mixtures we tried. Why? Because it had been used as a coal dump for years, and it was soft underneath, and the pavement would never stay level and it would crack. So we just chained it off and closed that parking lot in the winter. It was right over the quarry, or at least on the edge of the quarry. There's a Quality Inn hotel there today too, right across from Appalachian Brewery. But that's what it looked like at the time. So I want you to see this was a commanding position. We're not talking about a knoll here. We're talking about the key position on the battlefield that Ewell is looking at. And this view is a view of East Cemetery Hill, the other side of the hill. It was also called Raffensperger Hill at the time. It's the same geographic feature, Cemetery Hill, showing the water reservoir and the wells that were dug there for water, and through inertia would give water to people's homes down below after 1893. But I want you to see again how expansive the hill is. Look at it down the Baltimore Pike from the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse. This picture was taken looking down. You can see some Union encampments there as they cleaned up the battlefield after the battle. This is a massive hill. And you've heard me, if you've been with me before, many times talk about how the objective of Pickett's charge was that hill. That was the hill they were trying to take. And so Ewell would fall into criticism after the war for not taking it with the best opportunity on the end of the first day. So he said, the enemy had fallen back to a commanding position known as Cemetery Hill, south of Gettysburg, and quickly showed a formidable front there. On entering the town, I received a message from the commanding general to attack this hill if I could do so to advantage. Now that do so to advantage is another way of if practicable. Is it feasible? Is it sensible? Is it useful? Are you capable of doing it? Is there some advantage to be gained by taking it? I could not bring artillery to bear on it, and all the troops that were with me were jaded by 12 hours marching and fighting. And I was notified that General Johnston's division, the one and only one of my corps that had not been engaged, was close to the town. Cemetery Hill was not assailable from the town. And I determined with Johnston's division to take possession of a wooded hill on my left. What's the wooded hill? Culp's Hill. That's why the Southerners attacked Culp's Hill through the entire battle. It was the reverse way to get at Cemetery Hill. While attacking up, the Emmitsburg Road was the way to get at it from the west side. Culp's Hill was a way of getting at it from the east side, to pressure it in a pincer. Johnston's division to take position of a wooded hill on my left, on a line with and commanding Cemetery Hill. Before Johnston got up, the enemy was reported moving to outflank our extreme left, and I could see what seemed to be his skirmishers in that direction. Over on Benner's Hill, there was a fight, a skirmisher fight of the 27th Indiana, 2nd Massachusetts, 3rd Wisconsin, 13th New Jersey, skirmished with Company D of the 49th Virginia and with White's Comanches, Virginia Cavalry. And there was a fight there, and Ewell tells you in his report he actually witnessed the fight, and rumors were growing that there was a substantial Union force advancing on the York Road. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. On means toward. So they were advancing toward, via Benner's Hill, towards the York Road. That was the Confederate left flank and rear. They had broken the Union position at Barlow's Knoll. The Union was retreating through the town. The Southerners were pursuing, and suddenly they had to put on the brakes, pump the brakes. Why? There were rumors that troops with blue hats and red stars, 1st Division, 12th Corps, were flanking them. After a march from Littlestown, they had come up to flank them. So Ewell tells you the reasons why he didn't think it was practicable. Now, if practical also applied to people other than Robert E. Lee, to General Meade, the commanding Union general. Meade testified before the JCCW, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War. They were a congressional subcommittee, like there are congressional committees today that oversee all kinds of things, including national parks and budgets, and it's where bills start. There was a committee that oversaw the war. Why Congress funds wars, they ultimately have a right to this, there has to be accountability. It was a way of them keeping the commanders accountable to them by having them take a furlough day and by rail, get on a train, come to Washington, sit in the basement of the Capitol and be cross-examined by senators and congressmen. who would ask them questions. And it planted a seed in the mind of the general that in the next battle, I better think twice with everything I do, because I'm going to have to answer for it through a subcommittee of Congress later on. So Meade had to testify in March. He turned in a written statement in April. Then he had to answer some follow-up questions in May. This would have been months after the battle, in March, April, and May of 1864. It would have, when he arrived in Washington, he said, thousands of lies have been told about me by Doubleday and Sickles, and I can never undo them. He felt like that they were ganging up on him, but he went in and again, he took the high road and he answered questions. And he said in his March 5th testimony to Congress, he said, I had sent instructions in the morning to General Sickles, commanding the 3rd Corps, directing him to form his corps in line of battle on the left of the 2nd Corps, that's the left of Hancock's Corps, along Cemetery Ridge. And I had indicated to him, that's to Sickles, in general terms, that his right was to rest upon General Hancock's left. That would be in the area of the Pennsylvania Memorial, presumably. And his left was to extend to the Round Top Mountain, plainly visible, if it was practicable to occupy it. Did you know General Meade uttered the words, if practicable, here at Gettysburg? To Sickles about little. I remember the first time I saw that, I went, whoa, that's not my focus. I've got another program that I got to do in 2 days, but I've got to photocopy this, you know. So, and if you want to read through those testimonies, there's some wonderful nuggets in there. Bill Hyde edited them and put them in a handy book called Union General Speak. Get your own copy through Amazon. But if it was practicable to occupy it. Now, why wouldn't it be practicable? Why wouldn't it be practicable? That is, why couldn't you easily put it into practice? Why would it not be sensible? Why would it not be the utilitarian thing to do? And it is, Little Round Top is very steep. It's hard to get horse and mule-drawn artillery up there. Also, anytime you go into a battle, firemen know this when they go into a burning tower. I used to fight wildland fires out west. You never go into an area without determining the escape route. If there's no escape route, you don't go in. You carefully, it's like when the Southerners advanced to attack for Pickett's charge, they used Spangler Lane to get all their artillery out there on Emmitsburg Road Ridge to bombard Cemetery Ridge before they attacked. Or before Sickles advanced to the Peach Orchard, the artillery secured what is today U.S. Avenue and Wheatville Road or McGilvery Avenue. You have ways out and you have ways back. If you don't have a way out, you don't go in. So you don't go into a burning building if there's no way out. So it's hard to get guns up there and even harder to get them out. You just would lose them if the position were overrun. You'd have to spike them. That's take your bayonets, break them off in the priming hole, take the loading implements and leave. It's also, when you have a steep hill, it's hard to fire straight down. An attacker can get under the guns and you can't fire down at them. That's how the United States and its allies took Normandy Heights. It's so steep that once they got across the beach, when they got to the base of Normandy Heights, those German encasements couldn't fire straight down, so then they had blindside accesses through ropes to the top. And it was over and the encasements couldn't fire straight down. So the higher the hill, the more danger you're in of your opponent getting under your guns and then being ineffective. So it's steep, it's inaccessible. We could add some more to that. It's hard to resupply. He decided it wasn't practical. But let's look at his own words. Sickles said in his testimony, let's finish with Meade. Meade said, I answered General Sickles, certainly within the limits of the general instructions I have given you. Any ground within those limits you choose to occupy, I leave to you. So he gave him discretion. He said, if practicable, to occupy Round Top. Now let's look at Sickles' reply. Under oath, he said to Congress, on my way, I found that the enemy were moving up to the attack in great force in 2 lines of battle, supported by 3 columns. Fortunately, my left had succeeded into position on Round Top and along the commanding ridge to which I have referred, and those positions were firmly held by the 3rd Corps. Now, you look at that and you think, there's no truth to that at all. The 3rd Corps was not on Little Round Top. The 5th Corps was there. That they would arrive, Vincent's brigade would go up and secure the place. It was a signal station up there, but Sickles had not occupied it with infantry. So here he is under sworn testimony saying that his 3rd Corps was also on Round Top. And so, how do you reconcile this? Well, as you look at this particular Edwin Forbes painting, this is presumably the Rose Farm, and you can see Tilton and Schweitzer's brigade perhaps moving out to join Birney's division, 5th Corps moving up to the right of 3rd Corps to secure Rose Hill. And out in the distance, you can see the Seminary Ridge Woods, where Southern troops are beginning to attack. Kershaw's brigade, presumably, and then beside him, Barksdale, followed by Wolford. Paul Sims is behind Kershaw. And so the painting depicts that moment as Edwin Forbes painted it, and originally did a sketch for Frank Leslie's Civil War Illustrated at the time. But as we look at that, he's saying that he was on Round Top. Now, how do we reconcile that? We reconcile it in that Sickles presumed Houck's Ridge to be Round Top. And you say, well, how can that be? I don't know if you all know this or not, but Round Top, Little Round Top, Big Round Top, Wildcat Hill, Bushman Hill, all those hills, Houck's Ridge, which is Devil's Den, the local people just called them the Round Tops. They were not given distinct names until years later when monuments were being placed and veterans were coming back and comparing notes, writing articles and arguing with each other. And then every area was staked out with markers and they began to distinguish the names. Mead gracefully gives Sickles credit for just interpreting his orders wrongly, and doesn't purposefully say anything about Sickles not being on Round Top. He does say, though, in his testimony, that the 5th Corps arrived in time to occupy, with his help, because he rode down with the 5th Corps, to secure the left at Round Top. So Sickles was, borderline there with that statement. Now, our last example would be Mead to Slocum. Mead to Slocum. Slocum was the 12th Corps commander. During the campaign, he was known as the right-wing commander, even as Reynolds was known as the left-wing commander. He had 3 corps, did Slocum, under his command. That would be the 12th, the 5th, and the 6th at the operational level. And then once the armies consolidated, presumably his right-wing status would be reduced back to corps level. But he never reduced, in his mind, he never reverted back to being a corps command. And he elevated Alpheus Williams on-the-job training to be the 12th Corps commander. So Meade was writing to Slocum of an opinion that he had on the morning of July 2nd, second day of the battle, early in the morning. This is Meade now. The commanding general, that's himself, desires that you will at once examine the ground in your front and give him your opinion as to the practicability of attacking the enemy in that quarter. So Slocum, the right-wing commander, at 9:30 a.m. on July 2nd, this is hours before the fighting in front of the Round Tops, was asking Slocum to look into the practicability of making an attack on his right. At 10 a.m., he followed up with a decisive order written out by Daniel Butterfield and sent to Slocum, and there was no practicability in it. It was a direct order. It says, I want this to be a decisive attack. That's a military word. Decisive means an attack that ends the battle. He said, you're going to have parts of the 12th, the 5th Corps, and when the 6th Corps arrives, the attack should start. And the 6th Corps was further away than anyone knew at that point. They marched 32 miles on a single day. But this was a developing plan on the Union right. And you can still see Phil Lano's map showing the black bars down in the lower right-hand part of your screen to 12th Corps troops. And then 5th Corps troops would come up and join them. marching in on the Hanover Road. You know, the 5th Corps came in not by way of Baltimore Pike, Tawnytown Road, Emmitsburg Road, but came in from the east by way of the Hanover Road. And they married with the 12th Corps, and the beginnings of an attack was planned. This is well east of the battlefield, east of Wolf Hill, and they were going to overtake the Southerners in the upper right corner of your screen, Johnston's division. Wipe out all Confederate presence east of Gettysburg. Eliminate their ability to threaten wagon trains. The Union Army at Union Mills, 12 miles south, had between there and further south of there 30,000 horses and mules pulling miles of ambulances, ordnance wagons, artillery vehicles. They also had a number of, they brought the artillery reserve up by 10:30 a.m. on July 2nd. A lot of wagon trains parked all around Powers Hill, about 1.5 miles south of the main position at Cemetery Hill. Baltimore Pike was just parked alongside either side of all kinds of ammunition wagons. And that was easily accessible on that side of the battlefield. The Southerners the Union had lost track of Jeb Stuart on June 30th at Hanover. That was only 12 miles east of Gettysburg. They didn't know where he was, thought he could show up at any minute on that flank and cooperate with Johnston, threaten the way home. So Meade said, I want you to look into the practicability of making an attack. Now, why would he also want to make the attack? He would want to make it because you do not want to go to bed in the dark and the situation is one way and you're out away from the Army, the rest of the Army, far away from support. You don't know what it's going to look like when the sun comes up. Everybody and his brother might be surrounding you. So the idea of eliminating a threat to your supply trains was very, Meade was very concerned about that. So Slocum writes back, starts at 10:30, maybe completes it a little bit later. It's about an hour after the practicability order. And he says, General, says Slocum to Meade, your note of 9:30 is received. I have already made a better examination of the position in my front than I am able to now that we have taken up a new line. It is true that the enemy, if it is true the enemy are massing on our right, I do not think we could detach enough troops for an attack to ensure success. So he decided it was not practicable. And he took up a new line. He said, I took up a new line. That new line was what? Culp's Hill. The attack was supposed to be made, if it was to be practicable, against Johnston at Benner Hill, and that would have been better achieved in the area where they were earlier in the morning, around Wolf Hill. And then he added, I do not think the ground in my front held by the enemy possesses any peculiar advantages for him. Peculiar advantages sounds oddly familiar with what Ewell had said to Lee about attacking to advantage. It's another play on words. We're talking about language and rhetoric that's very close to if practicable. He was saying that Benner's Hill, as you look at this old 1895 photograph of Benner's Hill, where Johnston would launch his attacks against Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill is in the upper left part of your screen. You can even see the tower there on Culp's Hill. It must have been just built, or maybe I was imagining something, but I was straining my eyes and I think I saw the tower there. And that basically, he was saying to General Meade, it's not practical, and the position they have, you don't want it anyway. It doesn't really give them any particular advantages. The ground's all broken up. There are woods everywhere. There's a ravine called Rock Creek Valley, and it's marshy through there. It doesn't give them any peculiar advantage, and it turned out to be correct. Defending Culp's Hill worked, and the Union Army won the battle. But Meade had asked him to look into the practicability of making the attack. So in conclusion then, practicable is practical, that's useful and sensible, capable, able to be put into practice. And the two together are useful, sensible, and able to be put into practice. So think about that as you go through your day-to-day responsibilities. Ask yourself, is it practicable? Thank you for coming out today.